Every so often, an unlikely superstar rises to the top of the card in WWE. At one point, it was Daniel Bryan, at another point, it was Kofi Kingston, and as 2022 bleeds into 2023, it's now time for Sami Zayn. Of course, that shouldn't suggest he wasn't always great. No, in fact, every step of his story, from indie performer in Ring of Honor to being the heart and soul of NXT, all the way to comedy mid-carder on the main roster, it's all led to the point he's reached today. But how did it all happen? Well, join us today as we take a deep dive into his entire career journey so far in Feeling Ucey, the Sami Zayn Story. Ramy Sebe was born on July 12, 1984 in Laval, Quebec, Canada. And growing up in Quebec with a Syrian family, Sebe became fluent in English, French, and Arabic at a young age. And of course, young Ramy became a big fan of pro wrestling while at school, as after catching WWF on TV one day and falling in love with the work of fellow Canadians like Bret and Owen Hart, he'd decide that this was what he wanted to do with his life. Luckily then, after leaving school and beginning his training in the early 2000s with Savio Vega and Jerry Tweet, he'd quickly find out that he was a natural. So good was he, in fact, that it wouldn't be long before he was getting bookings on the local Quebec indie scene. And it was here that Ramy first met the man who, in years to come, would go on to be the yin to his yang, Kevin Steen. Yes, it's well documented now, but even as early as 2002, Sebe and Steen had become close friends. Hell, they basically considered each other brothers as they traveled all over the country together performing for audiences of wrestling fans. That said, it's at this point that we have to take a slight diversion in the story, because despite having all the potential in the world, Ramy decided to go on something of a sabbatical here after he and his wife discovered that they were about to have their first child. So with him out of action for the time being, it was left to another figure to rise up in his place, the mysterious El Generico. Who was El Generico? Well, that was always the question everyone wanted an answer to, and of course with him being tall, in possession of a big bushy beard, and having mannerisms suspiciously similar to Ramy Sebe, some actually came to believe he was the man under the mask, but that would be ridiculous, as at this point Ramy was off looking after his family. And sure, while the fact that Generico also seemed to be very close friends with Kevin Steen was another major clue for many, the majority realized that they were two separate people, just as they had with Hulk Hogan and Mr. America around the same time in WWE. So with that settled then, Generico spent the next couple of years working for local promotions like the International Wrestling Syndicate alongside Steen, with each waiting for the moment they'd finally get their big break. And this break came in 2004 as it happened because it was there they first started making appearances for Pro Wrestling Guerrilla. But even that was only the start, however, as once the duo were able to make a name for themselves in PWG, they'd get the call from both Chikara and Ring of Honor so as to do some dates there too. Yes, by now, things were starting to cook for the French Canadians, and El Generico in particular, because by 2007, he'd have won the PWG World title from Tornado. And as if that weren't enough, in 2008, he'd become a PWG Tag Team Champion alongside Kevin Steen too, with this being one of 5 times the future honorary Uce would hold those belts. Then, still not content with all of his success stateside, Generico ventured out east for a while as he started doing dates for Dragon Gate in Japan. That said, his real home would always remain in North America, something he proved when, upon his return in 2009, he'd light up PWG with matches against the likes of Kenny Omega and the Young Bucks, all while over in ROH, he and Kevin Steen were challenging other heavyweight opponents such as the Briscoe brothers. Of course, all good things have to come to an end eventually though, and so it was that in 2009, El Generico was turned on by his partner after the two lost the Ring of Honor tag team titles. Still, there was a silver lining to all of this, as the feud which came out of it proved to be one of the best the indie promotion had ever seen. Hell, so good was the former Friends' big climactic showdown at Final Battle 2010 in fact, it's still considered by many to be arguably the greatest match in all of ROH history. Needless to say then, as the new decade rolled around, the mysterious masked star was on a high, and he carried this over with him to every other promotion he worked for too. So it should come as no surprise to anyone that at this point, bigger companies like TNA and WWE started to come calling, with the former even getting Generico to do a tryout match soon thereafter. Unfortunately, though, it was also around here that the masked star fell prey to some pretty harsh punishments when, after apparently getting on the wrong side of the Mexican cartel, he'd disappear, never to be heard from again. Was he killed, or did he just go into hiding? That remains unknown. But what we do know is that, prior to vanishing, he came into contact with Ramy Sebi, and seeing how much potential he still had as a wrestler despite all his years away, Generico taught him everything he knew. And this proved to be a great decision because, now armed with not only his own natural talents, but also all the secrets El Generico had given him, it wasn't long before the French-Canadian returned to the ring and caught the interest of WWE. So interested were they, in fact, that in January of 2013, Triple H signed him to a contract, and from there, had him report to NXT. Of course, at this point, though, NXT wasn't quite the super indie it would later become. No, while it had moved away from its early game show format, it was still in something of a middle ground. But with the addition of Ramy, now renamed Sami Zayn, to the roster, things began to change, as over the next few months, he'd be partially responsible for proving to the game that the indies represented the future of the industry, and that if he wanted to be a part of this, he'd have to sign up the best they had to offer. Still, even with bigger names from the indies such as Prince Devitt, Pac, and Kenta gradually weaning their way in, none of them were quite on the level of Zayn. And this was proven in the fact that throughout 2013 and 2014, the main story of the Black and Gold brand would be his rise to the top. Seriously, outside of maybe the Johnny Gargano-Tommaso Ciampa feud, Sami's quest to win the title is probably the best story Triple H ever told during those years. And it all began in the first half of the former year when, despite coming in with all the momentum in the world, the new recruit underwent something of a losing streak. Yes, it didn't matter if it was Antonio Cesaro, Leo Kruger, or Bo Dallas, the boy from Quebec just couldn't pick up the win. That would begin to change as 2014 rolled around though, because here, with fans now starting to get behind him and his underdog story in a major way, Zayn picked up some wins over his old rivals. And of these matches, perhaps none were more noteworthy than his showdown with Cesaro at February 27th's TakeOver Arrival, as this proved to be an early example of the direction NXT was moving in. High work rate indie-style matches which wowed crowds with their athleticism and felt a million miles away from what Vince McMahon was doing over on the main roster. Still, even if he was now getting some wins, the fan favorite couldn't quite stick the landing. No, instead, whenever he found himself in a #1 contendership match, he'd lose, and as a result, see his chances of ever becoming NXT champion slip further and further away. As the year went on, however, his impressive performances and popularity amongst live crowds saw him continue to get more shots, with him even being part of a Fatal 4-Way match for the NXT title at TakeOver Fatal 4-Way on September 7th. But there, despite clearly being the better man on the night when positioned next to the other challengers Tyler Breeze and Tyson Kidd, in the end, the reigning champion Adrian Neville would screw him out of the win and go on to retain himself. And with Neville still being portrayed as a babyface at this point, it caused some friction between the pair. Friction which only got worse as when Zayn finally got a one-on-one match on the November 13th episode of NXT, the champ won again by screwy means, further cementing the idea that he was undergoing a slow heel turn. But that would only get fans more behind the challenger as, with him very clearly being the people's choice by now, they were desperate to see him finally achieve his goals. In order to do so though, he'd have to put his career on the line. Yes, at TakeOver Our Evolution on December 11th of that same year, Sami Zayn would get one more shot at Neville's title, on the provision that if he lost this time, he'd leave NXT altogether. So it's just as well he didn't lose here. No, after a battle which waged on for over 23 minutes, the French-Canadian pinned the Englishman to finally call himself NXT champion in one of the best feel-good moments the developmental show ever created. And what made this even more special was that on the very same night, his best friend Kevin Steen, now going by the name Kevin Owens, had just joined the roster of the Black and Gold brand too. But while it felt like a picture-perfect moment at first to see Owens come out and embrace Zayn while he was celebrating with the title, this love fest wouldn't last for long, because quickly showing his true heel side, KO powerbombed his friend into the ring apron, with him at that point announcing that he was only there for the top prize the brand had to offer. Needless to say then, Sami was only too happy to fight the man he'd once thought to be his brother, with this battle coming at TakeOver Rival just 62 days later, where the NXT title would be on the line. Unfortunately for the incoming champion though, the powerbomb onto the apron had done more damage than he thought. And so, with him only being at a percentage of his best during the big match, Sami found himself no match for Kevin Owens. And that was why, after receiving 5 powerbombs in a row, the champ was left out cold, with this forcing the referee to stop the bout and award the belt to KO by means of knockout. But while it was a hard loss for the Quebec native, it wasn't the end of things, because after picking himself up and dusting himself off, he'd make his first main roster appearance when, on the May 4th, 2015 episode of Raw, he accepted John Cena's open challenge for the United States title. That said, for as great as an ovation as he received here, things pretty quickly went sour because during his entrance, Sami injured his shoulder, and as a result, he was unable to pick up the win. So heading back down to NXT for the time being, he attempted to get his title back from Kevin Owens at TakeOver Unstoppable on May 20th. But with his shoulder injury still lingering, he was ultimately unable to do so. And at that point then, it became apparent that he would have to take some time off so as to go get surgery, with him not being seen on TV again for 7 months after this. Once he did return though, it would be in the biggest way possible, because following another main roster cameo at the 2016 Royal Rumble, the former NXT champion moved over there full-time in March of the same year. And with Kevin Owens now being on Raw too, the duo resumed their feud heading into WrestleMania 32, where they were both part of an Intercontinental title ladder match. Of course, this shouldn't suggest Sami was completely done with NXT yet. No, quite the contrary in fact, as after injury had stopped him from running out his time there on his own terms, he decided to make one final return for April 1st TakeOver Dallas, where he would get to be the man to introduce Shinsuke Nakamura to the WWE system. And what took place on that night would mark arguably a high point of Zayn's career, as in front of an absolutely electric crowd, the two put on a 5-star classic. Then, once it was over and the Canadian was able to say goodbye the way he wanted to, he'd return to Raw, where his program with Kevin Owens continued. But by now, the beef between the pair was getting so heated, it was clear something would have to be done to settle it once and for all. And that was why, at Payback on May 1st, they met in the ring, with Owens once again scoring the win here. That's right, no matter how much success he had elsewhere, the one dragon Sami Zayn was seemingly unable to slay was his best friend. Hell, even when he tried to detour by going after the Intercontinental title immediately thereafter, Owens always found a way of getting in his face and costing him the victory. So in an effort to finally put things to bed and allow each man to move on in their respective careers, the two agreed to meet one last time, with this marking the end of things no matter who came out the victor. And luckily then, at July 24th's Battleground pay-per-view, Sami finally got the big win over his rival he'd been so desperately searching for. Yes, with this mountain now conquered, he was free to extend himself out to other ventures which included starting a program with Chris Jericho heading into the autumn, then feuding with Braun Strowman for a while after that. Still though, for as entertaining as he was during this time, it felt very much like WWE were missing the boat on a big star by having him stuck in the mid-card, especially as Kevin Owens was only going from strength to strength elsewhere. Even after defeating Seth Rollins early on in 2017, then putting on an impressive showing in the Royal Rumble, Zayn wasn't able to rise above the level of afterthought under Vince McMahon's watch. And if you needed any evidence of this, you only had to look at his placement on the WrestleMania 33 card, where while KO was facing Chris Jericho for the US title, Sami was stuck in the Andre the Giant Memorial Battle Royal. So thankfully things would get better as the year went on then. That said, in order to get to this point, the eternal fan favorite had to do the unthinkable and turn heel. How did this happen? Well, after saving Kevin Owens during his Hell in a Cell match against Shane McMahon at that October's titular pay-per-view, Zayn began aligning himself with his real-life best friend once more, with his reasoning for this being that he now understood being the nice guy had gotten him nowhere. And in his defense, playing the villain saw him feel more important than ever, as after being drafted over to SmackDown so that he could be with KO full-time, the pair became a constant thorn in the sides of both Shane O'Mac and then SmackDown general manager Daniel Bryan. So when the impossible happened and Bryan got cleared to wrestle again after 4 years of being in enforced retirement, it meant Zayn and Owens were the natural opponents for him and the boss's son to take on at WrestleMania 33 on April 8th of 2018. And even if the French-Canadian duo lost this one, the spotlight that was shown on them, and Sami in particular, during it, meant that their stock would rise significantly as a result. In a pretty cruel twist of fate, however, it would also be here that the boy from Quebec once again injured his shoulder, with this forcing him to spend the next 10 months on the shelf. That said, he wasn't doing nothing during this time because while he was out recovering, he'd be working on his charity, Sami for Syria. But even if this was a real-life babyface act, when he returned to the ring in April of 2019, he'd continue to play the heel, albeit one whose stock had risen to the point that he was now in contendership for the Intercontinental title. And in order to help him on his path towards getting the belt here, Sami formed an unlikely partnership with his one-time NXT opponent, Shinsuke Nakamura. Of course, what he didn't realize at the time was that Nakamura also had eyes on winning the mid-card belt, and in the end it was him who would do so first. Come January of 2020 though, the King of Strong Style had dropped it to Braun Strowman, and this left the door open for Zayn to enter a 3-on-1 handicap match pitting him, Nakamura, and Cesaro against Strowman at March 8th's Elimination Chamber, where the French-Canadian was finally able to pick up the sneaky win and start his first reign with the strap. Unfortunately though, this reign would prove to be a short one because, as a result of the 2020 global shutdown, the champ was stripped of his title soon thereafter. So when he finally did return that summer, he began declaring himself the real champion, with him at this point developing the character of someone who felt that everyone in WWE was out to get him. But that wouldn't be his piece de resistance. No, this came when, after winning the IC title back from AJ Styles, losing it all over again to Big E, and then getting into a feud with Johnny Knoxville, which led to one of the most entertaining comedy matches in years at WrestleMania 38, the final part of the puzzle fell into place when the former NXT champion started aligning himself with the bloodline in the spring of 2022. That said, at first, with Vince McMahon still being in charge of the show and seeing nothing in Zayn but a mid-carder, the conspiracy theorists never really got to interact with Roman Reigns directly, only his cousins the Usos or the wise man Paul Heyman. Once Triple H took control of creative later that year though, this would change, as then Sami's attempts to earn the good graces of the top heel faction saw him get to be involved in segments with the tribal chief himself. And over time, not only would he win over all of the bloodline, minus Jey Uso of course, he'd also win over the hearts of fans again, as he became one of the most beloved figures on the roster. But then how couldn't he be when he was doing things like causing the entire stable to break character in the middle of the ring during the now famous Feeling Ucey segment? And when he wasn't bringing the laughs, he was also helping Roman, Jimmy, and Jay, and new recruit Solo Sikoa to get wins on a regular basis too. So after a while, the head of the table decided to make Sami an honorary Uce, with him even going as far as to have him join the Bloodlines team at that November's Survivor Series when they took on Kevin Owens, Drew McIntyre, Sheamus, Butch, and Ridge Holland in the first ever main roster War Games match. And it was after helping his side get the win here that Sami even managed to win over Jey Uso, the man who had been the lone holdout in accepting him into the tribe. That said, as 2022 bled over into 2023, and Kevin Owens became the next top contender for Roman Reigns' undisputed WWE Universal Championship, questions started to be raised once more as to where Zayn's real allegiances lay. But while the Canadian was still all in on the heel stable, it was becoming clearer to fans by now that Reigns was using his honorary Uce, getting everything he could from him before eventually cutting him off for good. Thankfully then, after a segment on the January 23rd episode of Raw that year, which saw Zayn go on trial for his perceived crimes, he'd start to see this too. And when at the Royal Rumble just 6 days later, the tribal chief demanded he destroy Kevin Owens even after their match was done, Sami finally saw the light and laid out Reigns with a chair shot to the back, all to one of the loudest ovations in years. Yes, with him now choosing his sides, it means that, at February 18th, 2023's Elimination Chamber, it'll be the fan-favorite Canadian going up against the head of the table, one-on-one, for the undisputed WWE Universal title in front of his hometown crowd in Montreal, Quebec. So even if he never gets to dethrone Roman, at the very least, Sami Zayn will now forever be able to hang his hat on the fact that, after years of hard work in getting there, he's now become the best thing in all of wrestling. It's enough to make El Generico proud of him.